Happy I've always wondered how people could successfully do a chair turn. Got my water ready to go. Happy Halloween. It's not Halloween anymore, but when I'm filming this, it was Halloween. So happy Halloween. I'm dressed in costume just for you. Don't forget to fold in the cheese. Boom. Okay, so astrology, November 2020. There are a couple of things going direct. We have a couple of ingresses into Scorpio. We have Sag season. And then the big thing we got to talk about is the final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So let's get right to it. So on the 3rd, not only do we have the election, but we have Mercury stationing direct in Libra, 25 degrees of Libra. Important to note that because it's stationing direct square to all the Capricorn daddies, aka Saturn, which tied to restriction, structures that are in place, perceived limitations, Jupiter, which is all about growth and expansion, and then also Pluto, which is tied to death, rebirth, and transformation. So pretty interesting day for those squares to be occurring, and important to note that it's likely to be an extraordinarily wonky day from a mercurial perspective, meaning all forms of communication, whether it's with the mail, whether it's through the phone, whether, technologically, don't expect it to be smooth sailings. And that applies for the days that follow. So I think it's really important to, during periods of retrograde and also at the station and shortly after when that shadow is especially strong, just to take into account and recognize what is and isn't in your locus of control. If there is miscommunication, if there is wonkiness from a personal level, I'm no longer talking about from the wide scale perspective, but from your level, just remember that the astrology, that's the energy that you got to work with. You got to power through it and recognize what is and isn't in your locus of control there. It is any day in which a planet is stationing one way or the other is this kind of doozy day energy, which is a very potent day for wonkiness to occur tied to planetary themes. So this is a week in which we can definitely expect a lot of miscommunication, a lot of miscounting of the ballots. Now talking more so about that, definitely don't expect to have the ducks in a row and the election to really settle this week, I would say, maybe the earliest Friday or something, but I unfortunately don't think it bodes well. Also important to note that that the last time that Mercury stationed on an election was 2000, and the 2000 election was, pretty historic for sort of how it kind of was dragged out. And people still are very unsettled with the results and how things were tabulated and counted. So unfortunately, I think that, we're not going to get the resolution on Tuesday, and that it will be dragged out. But recognize what is and isn't in your locus of control on that day. On the 10th, Mercury is going to ingress back into Scorpio. It stationed retrograde in Scorpio, went back into Libra, and then is now moving direct, so is in Scorpio. Unlike a Mercury in Libra, which leans to diplomacy and maybe doesn't assert themselves enough, Mercury in Scorpio is a very penetrating, intense, direct, in its own way, energy. Maybe not as direct as the other Mars-ruled Mercury, which would be Mercury in Aries, but it definitely is a very penetrating sort of energy. And given the fact that Mercury rules our mindsets and our attitudes, there's definitely a heightened intensity that comes with Mercury in Scorpio season. Of course, we dealt with Mercury in Scorpio once this year already, since Mercury had to retrograde back into Libra. So the energy is going to be a little familiar for sure. I do want to note that the entire month of November from this point will have Mercury being in Scorpio as it ingresses into Sagittarius on December 2nd. So I think just tied to the overarching energy of, the election and everything with that, there's definitely going to be a probing intensity around it. I think that if there isn't a resolution by the 10th, the real deep dive to get to the root of what's going on spikes for sure, or just at least the energy can work with investigative principles for sure. So definitely important to note for the 10th. For you on a personal level, I said last month that Mercury in Scorpio was a time to do a deep dive within. There is that invitation. Now, Mercury is no longer retrograde, but that doesn't mean there isn't that invitation within. That also applies to doing a deep dive into interpersonal relationships as well. Scorpio really does thrive in diving to the bottom of the ocean with a partner. And so, if there is something that you need to suss out or figure out in regards to a dynamic, this is the time to address it directly. It is a time to definitely not to choose to respond instead of reacting, because Scorpio is a Mars-ruled sign. So I think that it's important to be calculated about going about an assessment or an investigation, but definitely welcome to do so. Awesome. Okay, yeah. Okay, so on the 12th now is probably the most important transit, many could argue, of the month. And so we'll spend a little time sort of deducing it, delineating it, discussing it, if you will. So get out your water, we'll be talking. We have the final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. There were 3 of them this year. The first of which started April 4th, the second of which was on June 30th, and then the final of which, like I said, is on November 12th. A lot of things to discuss here. I think the first thing is let's just define just the high-minded principles or overarching properties of Jupiter and Pluto. So Jupiter is all about growth and expansion. It's tied to our philosophies, our belief system for sure. From the natal perspective, and I guess this could also just be applied in general, it's our sense of conviction, like kind of right versus wrong, if you will, and important to note just given everything else going on and the fact that this conjunction is occurring the day before Mars stations direct. So when we're talking about right and wrong and our sense of conviction as it's tied to our belief systems and our worldview, there of course is going to be kind of like a push comes to shove when it comes to that. Now, Jupiter is also associated with restlessness for sure. Kind of tied to that growth and expansion element to it. There's a reason why Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. And then if you own, I recommend that you do own Lehman's book of rulerships, which takes the traditional perspective on rulerships. Lily associated justice with Jupiter. And also Ptolemy actually associated stupidity with Jupiter, which I don't really appreciate as a quadruple Sagittarius, but I can understand given the fact that it's so focused on potential and on the horizon and on big ideas and not like the fine details, if you will. Important to note as well, while Mars, of course, across the board is like the primary ruler of plagues, Richard Saunders, who is a very noted medical astrologer in the history of medical astrology, gave Jupiter co-rulership of plagues according to Lehman's book. And this is important because with Pluto, we have the planet of death, rebirth, transformation. And so from a modern standpoint, with a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, of course we can associate the pandemic or plague in general to these two luminaries meeting. So to me, I am, of course, concerned about a third wave really kind of being ignited or ushered in officially with this conjunction. I think I brought up the Ptolemy recommendation, not only because is it funny that he's calling Jupiter like the ruler of stupidity, but my fear is that there has been a waning in concern around the pandemic. Some may consider people acting stupidly, for sure, or recklessly, which could lead to unnecessary death. So definitely take this conjunction as sort of a invitation, we'll say, to re-up your precautions and just be smart about navigating if there is another wave of the pandemic. Now, Jupiter, like I mentioned, does Lily associated with justice and has to do with our philosophy and sense of right and wrong. Pluto has to do with unhealthy power dynamics, rebirth, transformation. So I do think that this conjunction, my hope is that if there isn't resolution about the election, it catalyzes some very important movement to getting that resolution. And hopefully the arc is towards justice and equity, and like it's in a good way. It's a very important point to look at in your own chart. It's happening at 22 degrees of Capricorn, which is the exact degree that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurred at in January of this year. So wherever 22 degrees of Capricorn is, whether you use a quadrant or a whole sign house system, there's just been repeated heavy activity in this house, and important to pay attention to the themes of the house and how those themes related to your life have just totally been upended and changed since January of this year, given everything that's gone on, since there's been a Saturn-Pluto conjunction and 2 other Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. Jupiter conjunct Pluto could definitely symbolize unearthing what's buried, especially tied to the themes of that house. So I would definitely, if you are going to do sort of a, look at your chart and look at these degrees and see what aspects these transits have continued to form at 22 or 24 degrees of Capricorn, important to see what has been unearthed this year and what has been permanently altered and shifted, given that Pluto is tied to that death, rebirth, transformation. Jupiter augments, Saturn is tied to structure when we're talking about the January aspect. So I would recommend pulling out your chart and doing so. There's plenty of free generators online if you don't have a chart in front of you. Also, my website is in the bio, so if you wanted to schedule a reading, I'm happy to dive in very specifically with you on specifically where this hits. But this is a fundamental transit for this year in sort of the history of this year when astrologers look back on it. So definitely take note. Now, important to note as well that it is the closing of a cycle of 3 transits. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that this day specifically, there's some sort of big bang boom kind of thing, but it is a catalyst for future substantial change for sure. So on the 13th, we have a new moon in Scorpio, and I'm going to go ahead and share the chart. Let's just share the chart, shall we? Cool. Share. Great. Cool. Wonderful. Fun. Hold on. Now I need to see it. Great. So on the 13th of November, we have a new moon in Scorpio, and I am sharing the chart for it. And honestly, I feel like there's yays and nays with this chart. I think the big yay that I want to note for it is that the new moon, which you can see is happening at 23 degrees of Scorpio, is going to be sextile all the Capricorn daddies. And a sextile is a catalyzing, typically viewed as a harmonious transit. And it's also going to be in a weaker trine, 5-degree orb, but trine nonetheless to Neptune. So when we view new moons as manifesting agents or, transits in which manifestation should occur around, like a couple of days after, I do feel positively that there is that innate ability and that potency with this lunation. Unlike the lunations in October, which to me felt a little more threatening, I feel like there is the invitation to manifest. Especially, I love the timing given that it's at the end of the Gregorian year, going into next year, sort of really thinking about what you want to manifest. Now, from the nay perspective, there is an exact Venus square to Pluto, which is a pretty obsessive energy. Venus is tied to our values, it's tied to our self-worth, it's tied to our views on beauty, personal finance, that sort of thing. And with Pluto, we get those unhealthy power dynamics, we get shame, we get resentment, we get our struggles with vulnerability. And given the fact that it's built into the new moon chart right here, in addition to cultivating manifestation tied to hopes and dreams, which I think Neptune is helping with here, I would also recommend trying to cultivate some sort of shift, qualitative shift in dealing with your own brand of how Venus square Pluto manifests for you, whether it's in an obsessive way about checking people's social media from your past, or whether it's in sort of worrying about things outside of your control, or whether it's in really having that inner self-critic spike, whatever it may be, I think it's important to identify a quality that you really seek to embody, and then sort of allow yourself through meditation or therapy or through other means to really dig deep and figure out sort of the root causes for why you're seeking to embody this. Pluto and Scorpio are both tied to burying and to what is buried. So there is a root cause there, or root causes there, which I definitely hope you can use this energy to try to dig deep and like permanently evolve, or transform the way in which you go about navigating that specific issue with you. The other thing that's important to note with this new moon chart is that we're dealing with Mercury opposite Uranus, which it was opposite Uranus when it stationed retrograde. And this is sort of the last Mercury opposition to Uranus for this year. So kind of closing in the loop in the cycle there. It's an agitating mental energy. It's also tied to like shock reveals as well. So, just important to note, not from the manifestation standpoint of what I just talked about, but just for the overarching energy, it can definitely usher in unexpected news. Overall, I do honestly like this chart from the manifestation standpoint. If you do ritual around new moon, I think waiting a couple of days after is typically what I like to do to sow the seeds. And yeah, have fun. Good luck. Enjoy. All right. So the 21st is a big day for me. For me, but for everyone, but for me, but for everyone, but for me. So the 21st, not only is it Sag season, but it's my Venus return, aka it's the start of Venus in Scorpio. I'm a Sagittarius with 0 degrees Venus in Scorpio in the 7th house. And let me just tell you something. We have some stuff to talk about. So it's Sag season. It's our time. Where's my archers at? Cool. I should make that into a t-shirt. No, I shouldn't. Anyway, so let's talk about Sagittarius for a second. I'm not sure if you talk about Sagittarius a lot. I may. I just happen to be a Sagittarius sun, moon, Mercury, Mars. No big deal. Pisces rising. So Sagittarius means the archer. It comes from the word Sagitta, which I probably butchered. And Sagitta means archer. And then going a little bit deeper, it also derives from the word Sagire, which means seek to know, which is why the Sagittarius motto is typically known as I seek. And so that's really kind of what frames Sag season typically is I seek. And I think it's important for you to get in touch with what you seek. What do you seek? What do you seek? What do you seek? What do you seek? What do you seek to know? Given the fact that Sagittarius is a Jupiter-ruled sign, very much tied to, running towards the horizon, what's next, kind of big picture thinking, if you will. I almost wonder if this is a good time to really take into account, this year has beaten us all down, right? It has totally beaten us all down. And so in what ways are you going to rise up, and what do you seek to embody moving into 2021? In addition to what you seek, I think one of my favorite qualities in Sagittarius is the cheerleader element that Jupiter brings to it. And in addition to being other people's cheerleaders or life coaches, Sag is the preacher and the teacher for sure. How can you be your own cheerleader? In addition to what you seek, how can you cheer yourself on in the actual act of seeking? I think that that's a big question to ask yourself. And you can also really kind of dive deep and really sort of address, how have you limited or prevented yourself from being your own cheerleader in the past? Yeah, for sure. In addition to that, I just spoke about Jupiter for a second. For the most part, Jupiter is going to be in Capricorn for Sag season, which is a little bit of a boner killer or a wet blanket. Jupiter will be ingressing into Aquarius in the last couple of days of Sag season. And with Aquarius, we get innovation, it's a little detached from emotion for sure, but we definitely get that progression forward. And so how do you seek to progress and innovate yourself at the end of this year going into 2021? You made it through 2020, but I definitely think that the world is permanently changed from this year. And the dust hasn't settled, of course, but how do you seek to innovate yourself to adapt to this new world? Because Sag is a mutable fire sign. It is very adaptable. So I would answer those questions. Now, with Venus and Scorpio, I love Venus and Scorpio now, since Venus and Scorpio will die for you. What is more romantic than someone who will literally die for you? Now, one thing that I've come to learn about Venus is that Venus doesn't like working in extremes, which is why Venus and Aries and Venus and Scorpio, the Mars-ruled signs, are referred to as Venus being in its detriment. And I personally don't view this as a negative. Venus is a little uncomfortable working in extremes, which it does in these two signs, but there is a lot of value that it can bring. Scorpio is this intense probing energy, and Venus is tied to the themes I mentioned of self-worth, value systems, beauty, personal finance, intimacy, those sorts of things. Scorpio actually does intimacy really well, but really intensely. And so I do believe that Venus and Scorpio season is an audit or an invitation to really confront your relationship to intimacy. I do many things not well. Intimacy is something I do well. It's something I can innately, with Venus and Scorpio in the 7th house, do well, sometimes a little too well. And I've had to learn myself and how to navigate with Venus and Scorpio. But I think for everyone, intimacy is not a comfortable thing because it's tied to shame and vulnerability. So there is absolutely that invitation to specifically confront comfortabilities and relationship attachment styles with intimacy. And I think it's a really good invitation for you to take up on. So last but not least, we have a lunar eclipse in Gemini, which is a full moon eclipse in 8 degrees. So eclipses get kind of a reputation, right? Eclipses signify endings or important shifts in the related to the house themes that they fall in. So important for you to look at where 8 degrees of Gemini and 8 degrees of Sagittarius is, or just your houses that rule, that have the Gemini house cusp and the Sag house cusp. Important to note because the eclipses are going to be going through those houses this season, then Gemini season 2021, and then Sag season 2021 as well. There might be one eclipse that occurs along the Taurus Scorpio axis, but for the most part, these are the house axes that you need to be looking at. And what's really important to note is that eclipses kind of are uncontrollable. They were really kind of viewed malefically way back when because of the fact that they can signify sudden endings or severings or just important shifts related to those house themes. LeAnn Rimes sings, "Can't fight the moonlight." You know, you can try to resist, try to hide from that kiss, but honey, that eclipse is going to be hitting your chart in some house axes, and there are going to be shifts that are ushered in from that. So especially if you are a Sag or a Gemini rising, I think it's important to really pay attention to the eclipses this year because eclipses that occur in the 1st, 7th axis are definitely felt more profoundly, given that the 1st house is the house of self. It's how you navigate life. It's your appearance. And then the 7th house is those partnerships. You with another. I consider the 1st house I with myself and the 7th house I with another. So especially for Sag and Gemini risings, but nonetheless, it's going to hit your chart somewhere. And I just really want you to be prepared. And really, you can't really work with an eclipse, but you can go with the flow and anticipate those changes to occur. You can even view them as invitations if you're already feeling the itch for some sort of major shift tied to those house themes. House themes, here you go. So aside from the fact that the eclipse is falling along the Gemini-Sag axes, which is known as the teacher-student axis, or it could be viewed as the narratives we tell ourselves versus the unfiltered truth axis. It could be local community versus the world. There isn't a heck of a lot going on in the actual chart itself to me. The moon is answering to Mercury, which is sextile the cat daddies in Scorpio. And so I actually think that this is a very illuminating energy in regards to whatever probing inventory that you've really been undergoing over the last few months. And I think it could kind of be a catalyzing, shift changing energy in that way, in sort of making headway. Or it could at least like initiate action per se. There's a difference between like investigation and then action that follows from it. And I think that it could initiate action for sure. The sun itself is answering to those cat daddies, to Jupiter specifically, but it's conjunct both of the other daddies. It's kind of in a little daddy sandwich right in the middle. Aside from that, we have Venus opposite Uranus, which is anything opposing Uranus is going to be a shakeup tied to Venusian themes. It could be with partnership. It could be with your own self-worth. It could be with how you view yourself from a beauty standpoint or from a value standpoint. But I actually don't think for this chart, there's like that really is the thing that shines through, because neither part of the eclipse agents, the sun or the moon, is really like answering to that. It's just a secondary factor to note. I think what's most important in taking away from this eclipse is really paying attention to, in your chart, where does 8 degrees of Sag and 8 degrees of Gemini fall, and what does it aspect, since that's how it hits you personally. Once again, important to note that with eclipses, you cannot fight the moonlight. You cannot try to resist it. Listen to that LeAnn Rimes song, please. Maybe watch Coyote Ugly. I don't know. But I do think it's important to note that while you can't work with that energy per se, you can go with the flow. And both of these signs are mutable, adaptable signs that can go with the flow. So I don't care if you are all fixed energy, do your best, go with the flow. Okay, I just ran out of water just in time. That was your November 2020 astrology weather report. I'm trying to be the astrological Sam champion. Shout out to him. Please subscribe below for more monthly videos. This Taking the Scare Out of the Square series is coming back live, so expect new videos with that. And I just launched a website, so my website is below as well. Feel free to find me on Instagram at liveyourtruth_Lars.com. Pretty sure that's my name there. And on Twitter at liveyourtruth_Lars.com. If you had any comments about, how this month affects you, please leave them below. If you have hate mail, shove it up your ass and have a good day.